Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. Just kidding. My husband totally dared me to start my lecture with that today. Anyway, happy Wednesday if you are in fact watching these kind of with the pacing guide. I just wanted to pop on, say hello again. Um, Today we are going to be talking about research strategies. So not just like the scientific method, right? Not just this idea about like how do we approach psychology as a science, but actually like how do we implement that research. We're going to look at case studies, observational tactics into understanding research, right? We can't just be like, I wonder what effect brain damage has on the brain, right? Let's go give somebody brain damage. Obviously, that's not ethical and that's not something that we can do as psychologists. So we're going to look at how do psychologists actually do those studies. So stick with me. At the end of the lecture, you will have a formative check just to kind of see where you're at, how you're doing. And if you have any questions, again, I will always be available. Make sure you're writing down any misunderstandings that you have throughout the lecture in your notes so that you can, in fact, ask those questions of me in our office hours. All right, have fun.
So, as I just said, we are going to be talking about research strategies today, and that really starts off with this idea of descriptive research, which is a systematic, objective observation of people. And we can do this through kind of a number of means. We are going to look into more detail at case studies, naturalistic observations, surveys, and interviews, but we know for all of these kind of methods in descriptive research, the goal is to provide a clear, accurate picture of people's behaviors, thoughts, and attributes. So when we're talking about descriptive research, we're talking about it in contrast with, like, say, an experiment, something that we put together and test a certain hypothesis, right? Instead, descriptive research is really looking at this is the way that things are. This person had brain damage, so we're going to observe their behaviors, thoughts, and attributes. Or these children are growing up and we don't want to mess with their like access to resources, so we're just going to look at kids without access to preschool versus kids with access to preschool. A lot of the reason that people, or well, the main reason why people engage in descriptive research as opposed to like doing experiments is because of ethics. We are going to talk about ethics here shortly, but it's really important to recognize, again, I mentioned like I want to know what brain damage does to a person and what happens to their personality. You can't just go give somebody brain damage. Same thing with like the preschool example. Let's see how children raised in communities that have access to preschools versus those who do not are raised. We can't just be like, let's take kids and not give them preschool and see what happens, right? Like that's not ethical, that's not beneficial to the participant. So instead we engage in descriptive research. And that again is this idea of let's see what already is in existence and try and figure out like why that is the case and put some facts and understandings to what already exists. So the first example of a descriptive research practice that we're going to look at is a case study. And this is when we examine one individual in depth. The picture or the image on this slide is a real life accident that took place. It happened to a man named Phineas Gage. We're going to watch a short video clip on his story. He, as I mentioned in kind of my intro, is somebody who's going to come up multiple times throughout our study of psychology and biopsych, in personality psych and intelligence, right? So having an understanding of who he is and what his case presents and the information that it provided us with is really important. But we are using him to really reference what is a case study, right? The benefits of case studies includes that they can be a source of ideas about human nature in general, but a danger could be an overgeneralization from one example, right? We look at this one case and we say, we understand this now. That can be problematic, and that like it could just be a fluke situation, or it could be this person's individual experience was different from somebody else's. So we understand that it gives us insight into human nature in general. Again, like a injury such as the one depicted here, we could never recreate because that would be terrible to do to somebody. But because it happened accidentally, we're able to use his experience to better understand certain areas of the brain. So we, like I said, are going to watch a quick video. The clip on this slide is a little bit longer and, goes over the case of Phineas Gage. And so when we watch it, I just want you to think about how this case study really gives us an example of this particular type of descriptive research.
On September 13, 1848, a 25-year-old Phineas Gage was helping excavate rocks to make way for a railroad track on the Rutland and Burlington Railroad near Cavendish in Vermont. Gage was preparing for an explosion by compacting a bore with explosive powder using a tamping iron. Unfortunately for him, but fortunately for science, a spark created from the tamping iron ignited the powder, driving the iron straight through Gage's skull. It entered under the left cheekbone and exited completely through the top of the head and was later recovered some 30 yards away, smeared with blood and brain matter. To have an idea of the extent of damage this iron would have caused, you need to realize its size. The tamping iron was 3 foot 8 inches, that's 1.11 meters in length, and 1.25 inches, that's 3.18 centimeters in diameter at one end, and tapered over a distance of about 1 foot to 0.25 inches or 0.6 centimeters in diameter, and it weighed approximately 13 pounds or 6 kilograms. After the rod passed through his head, it is not known whether Gage lost consciousness, but within minutes of his injury, at the astonishment of the men on his crew, he was walking and talking and sat upright in an ox cart for the 3/4-mile ride to his house, where he was attended to by Dr. Edward H. Williams, who described the situation as such. When I drove up, he said, "Doctor, here is business enough for you. I first noticed the wound upon the head before I alighted from my carriage, the pulsations of the brain being very distinct. The top of the head appeared somewhat like an inverted funnel, as if some wedge-shaped body had passed from below upward. Mr. Gage, during the time I was examining this wound, was relating the matter in which he was injured to the bystanders. I did not believe Mr. Gage's statement at that time, but thought he was deceived. Mr. Gage persisted in saying that the bar went through his head. Mr. G got up and vomited. The effort of vomiting pressed out about half a teacupful of the brain, which fell upon the floor." By evening, Dr. John Martin Harlow had taken over the case, and it was his notes of observations about Phineas's injury, subsequent recovery, and personality changes that provided evidence that the frontal cortex is involved in one's personality. The initial treatment of Phineas's physical injuries included cleaning the wound by removing small fragments of bone and replacing some of the larger fragments that were still attached but displaced. The large wound at the top of his head was closed with adhesive straps and covered with a wet compress to allow the wound to drain into the dressings. Within days, his exposed brain became infected and he fell into a semi-comatose state. To his family's relief and surprise, he actually recovered. Not long after that, Dr. Harlow had to release 8 fluid ounces of pus from an abscess under George's scalp. Despite all of this, only 3.5 months after the accident, Phineas Gage was leading a seemingly normal life, contrary to many outlandish accounts that soon popped up, most of which have been dismissed as myth due to a complete lack of evidence. However, those closest to him did notice slight changes in his personality and behavior. In 1868, in a report published in the Bulletin of the Massachusetts Medical Society, Dr. Harlow wrote, "His contractors, who regarded him as the most efficient and capable foreman in their employ previous to his injury, considered the change to his mind so marked that they could not give him his place again. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint of advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operation, which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned, in turn for others appearing to be more feasible. In this regard, his mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage." Not the same man he used to be and denied employment by the railroad company who used to see him as an efficient and capable foreman, he worked for a short time at a livery stable in New Hampshire, among other odd jobs. He then spent 7 years as a stagecoach driver in Chile until his health began to deteriorate. Evidence uncovered very recently, in 2008, seems to indicate that before his demise while working in Chile, Gage had recovered most, if not all, of his former social skills and was otherwise a pretty normal guy at one point. Once his health declined, he moved to San Francisco with his mother, where, after suffering a series of epileptic seizures, he died on May 20th, 1860, at the age of 36, almost 12 years after his accident. It wasn't until 1866 that Dr. Harlow, who'd thought he would never hear from Phineas again, learned of his death. At his request of the family, Phineas's skull was removed from his grave and sent, along with the tamping iron that had pierced Phineas's skull, to Dr. Harlow in Massachusetts. Today, both can be seen at the Harvard University School of Medicine in the Warren Anatomical Museum. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that like button below and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos every day of the week. Also, if you want something else, we've got a podcast. It's called The Brain Food Show. You can check it out on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Brain Food, one word, and it'll pop up. And as always, thank you for watching.
So with that example, Phineas Gage's example of a case study, we are now going to move on and look at naturalistic observation, right? This is pretty intuitive. This is exactly what it sounds like. It means just watching and not trying to change anything, right? We're taking notes, we're watching, in this particular example, we're watching children interact with one another, and we're taking notes. How do they interact? Is it different when they're 2 years old versus when they're 4 years old, right? Are kids who are engaging with ethnically diverse children engaging in a different manner than those engaging with people of their own ethnicity, right? We're putting kids, or whatever our subjects are, in kind of a looking glass and figuring out what are these interactions like, what are these behaviors, and where do they stem from. So this is a method that can be used to study more than one individual, and its goal is to find truths that apply to a broader population. So let's just put kids in a playroom and watch them and see what happens, and take away this understanding that, like, how this randomly assigned population of kids can be representative of kids as a whole. The last one here then is going to be the survey. A survey is a method of gathering information about many people's thoughts or behaviors through self-report rather than observation, right? Like, you know what a survey is, but what is its relevance when we're talking about descriptive research and when we're talking about psychology, right? The keys to getting useful information is to be very careful about the wording of your questions, and you're only going to question randomly sampled people. We are going to talk about statistics tomorrow, and there's like a bajillion different problems that can be presented by surveying people. One of those is, I can't even remember what it's called. I took psychology in high school and college, but like the idea that if you are going around and calling people for to find out who they're voting for, right? If you're calling from the office of Bernie Sanders, right? And you're like, hey, are you voting for Bernie Sanders? If people are, they're more likely to respond yes. If they're not, they're more likely to abstain from even putting in their opinion. Therefore, your results are going to be skewed. And so just recognizing that this randomly sampled group that's being surveyed is so critical and important, because then you're getting a real sample of the population. You're not just getting the people who are riled up about something or who have time on their hands to answer survey questions. You're getting kind of a bit of all the people's ideas. And so that's really, really important. The other thing, the first thing that's listed here, right, being careful about wording of questions, right? Wording affects the results you get from a survey, and they can be changed by your word selection. So looking at this example, and talking about online psychology, say, we're just looking at this particular course now that we've moved to e-learning. Do you have motivation to study hard for this course versus do you feel a desire to study hard for this course, right? Someone wanting to make students look ambitious would choose the first question, right? Do you have motivation to study hard for this course? Easy. Yeah, I want to do well. I want to study hard. Somebody who wants to make students look lazy could choose the second one. Do you have a desire? Do you feel a desire? That word choice is like, I don't know. I guess I don't have a desire. It's not my deepest passion to study for this course, but I do want to do well. So again, just an example of recognizing how wording can in fact impact people's responses. So you have to be very careful about wording when using surveys, and you have to have a randomly sampled population. So there you have it with the descriptive research. You have case studies. Think about Phineas Gage. You have naturalistic observation, like watching kids interact, and you have surveys, right? Gathering information based on self-response of people filling out kind of a survey or a questionnaire of sorts. So moving on then, oh man, this all got messed up. Hopefully you guys have access to the actual slide decks that I linked on Canvas, but it's important to recognize why we take a sample. Again, I kind of referenced some of this, so bear with me. It's important to take these samples, and it's important for these samples to be random, right? Down here in this circle, this red circle, is a definition for random sampling. I'll just read it to you real quick. Random sampling is a technique for making sure that every individual in a population has an equal chance of being in your sample, right? Random means that your selection of participants is driven only by chance and not by any characteristic, right? You don't, if you want to find out something about men, you can't interview every single man on earth. So instead, we sample. It saves time. You can find the ratio of colors in this jar by making sure they were all mixed up, randomized, and then taking a sample, right? So if you think about so we want to find out about men. Are men angrier than women? We're going to talk about kind of gender stereotypes later on in psychology, but are men angrier than women, right? Well, what we have to be careful of is saying well, I'm here, I live in Minnetonka, I'm at my house, I'm just going to send out a survey to all of the people in my neighborhood. That seems like a pretty average sample. Well, it's not, right? People who live in my neighborhood all have a similar socioeconomic status. Generally speaking, they have similar life backgrounds, right? Not everybody, but on a big, wide scale, right? A lot of people have kids and dogs and single-family homes, right? Which may lead to the understanding that they have certain types of jobs. And so that's not a random sample, and that's not going to give me insight into all men across the globe. What I'd have to do is I'd have to put every man into a random generator, and I'd have to get some people from Seattle, and then from small town Pennsylvania, and people from Minneapolis, and people who are rich and poor, black, white, atheist, Christian, Jewish. I have to get a whole gamut in order to get a real understanding of men as a whole. So that's it. That's the importance here of taking a sample and specifically random sampling, right? You can't just be I'm just going to look at everybody at Wayzata High School. That'll give me a sense of all high schoolers in the country. It won't, because Wayzata High School is unique. Wayzata High School is affluent. Wayzata High School has a lot of opportunities that many other schools don't. And so just recognizing that this random sampling is extremely important when we're talking about how we engage in research. So talking about what are these aspects or these ways to engage in descriptive research, what is the outcome? What can we take away from descriptive research? That's what we're going to shift to now. And the potential is that we could find some sort of correlation, right? The general definition is an observation that two traits or attributes are related to each other, thus they are correlated, right? This idea that having access to preschool will make you more successful as a graduate of high school, right? If you went to preschool, you are more likely to graduate high school. That's a positive correlation. So what does that actually mean in terms of our understanding in a case study, in naturalistic observation, and in a survey? Again, general definition, an observation that two traits or attributes are related. Scientific definition, and this is important because not all research ends with correlation, and we know that correlation does not always equal causation. Our scientific definition is a measure of how closely two factors vary together, or how well you can predict a change in one from observing a change in the other. So just kind of recognize that, like, scientifically speaking, you need to have a certain mathematical equation, which we're not going to get into. We're just going to big picture look at it. If you take like AP stats, you'll get into that and determining the math behind correlation. But a correlation, which we'll look at, can be like a positive one, meaning like if this happens, 100% of the time this also happens. Or it can be a negative one, which means like if this happens 100% of the time, this doesn't happen. So establishing correlation is one idea that we can kind of think about when we are looking at the results from descriptive studies. So here you have, right, in a case study, you could look at, the fewer hours the boy was allowed to sleep, the more episodes of aggression he displayed, right? This one individual. On any given day, if he slept less, he was more aggressive the following day, right? We can understand limited sleep is correlated to higher levels of aggression. In naturalistic observation, children in a classroom who were dressed in heavier clothes were more likely to fall asleep than those wearing lighter clothes, right? Overall, we're watching all the kids in the classroom. Those that have heavier clothes are correlated or more likely to fall asleep. So there's a correlation between heavy clothes and being tired. And then the last one here, in a survey, the greater number of Facebook friends, the less time was spent studying, right? So in a survey, somebody sends out a questionnaire to a randomly sampled population and everybody says, I have 342, maybe Instagram followers is more accurate, or like TikTok people, I don't know. Followers? You follow people on TikTok, yeah. In a survey, you say, like, I have 378 TikTok followers, and they can attribute how much time you spend studying. I spend 10 hours studying, whereas somebody who maybe has 1,000 followers spends 5 hours studying. Therefore, there'd be like a negative correlation in terms of more friends equals less studying. Again, correlation. We do know correlation does not always equal causation. We'll look at that in a second, but these are some examples of how correlation can be pulled from this type of research. So as we know, correlation is looking at the relationship between two events or attributes or traits or whatever. This particular graph is showing us a negative correlation, right? The higher number of studying hours per week on that y-axis leads to an increased number of friends on Facebook, right? As one number goes up, the other number goes down. So these two factors which correlate, we know that they vary together. So we can see kind of a trend. We can see a pattern. People with more Facebook friends, if you're looking down in this like right-hand corner, study less. So nearly 0 hours are spent studying, whereas people who have no Facebook friends have on this top left of the graph, right, spend a lot more time studying. So this is a negative correlation. Again, we're going to look at the difference between a negative and a positive correlation and what some of these numbers might mean behind correlation. But this is just one example of a graph depicting correlation. So here we have that kind of comparison, looking at all the pieces of the puzzle as it pertains to correlation. And that comes from this idea of correlation coefficient. Now, yesterday we talked about operational definitions, right? How do we put tangible, quantifiable measures to intangible, abstract things, right? How can we define this idea that sleepwalking is not dreaming, right? Those abstract ideas. How can we put quantifiable measures to some of these abstract psychological ideas? The same thing is going here for correlation coefficient, right? Correlation being the relatedness of two events. If you have a correlation coefficient, you are basically putting a number to represent how related those events are. So the definition here, correlation coefficient is a number representing the strength and direction of correlation. The strength of a relationship refers to how close the dots are to a straight line, which means one variable changes exactly as the other one does. This number varies from 0 to positive or negative 1. And that can kind of be like, think about it as like your slope, and how far away those dots are from this line of correlation. So if we look here, I'm going to draw, I haven't done this before, so we're going to go a little crazy. So if we're looking at something that has a positive correlation, right, down here the direction, if you're looking kind of at this particular example, this is a positive correlation, right? As a variable increases, another variable also increases, right? The more alcoholic beverages you drink, the more often you cry or get upset, right? There's a positive correlation between alcohol consumption and certain behaviors. So that's going to be our example of a positive correlation, right? Over here then, right, our negative correlation is saying like, we use the example on the last slide looking at Facebook friends and studying per week. As the number of Facebook friends increases, the amount of time studying decreases, right? And so you have kind of this positive and negative correlation. Now the strength is what I want to talk about here real quick. If every single person on your study falls exactly on that line, right, just like I kind of drew those dots there, we know that there's a very strong correlation. In fact, you would call that correlation coefficient positive 1, right? But what if some of the dots look like this, right? There's clearly a trend. We clearly see a trend moving this way, even though it's not straight to that line, right? There is a trend, there is a relationship, but that relationship isn't as strong as positive 1. So this might be, say, like a 0.7 correlation coefficient. Now, you again do not need to know the math behind how to find a correlation coefficient. You are going to have to recognize, right, that this is less than 1, but there is correlation, right? If the dots are kind of all over the place, oops, wrong pen. If the dots are kind of all over the place like this scatter plot, right, we would say there is no correlation. But all of a sudden, you have a cluster, right? Say you studied way more people in this red study than the blue study I was just looking at, right? Even though there are some what we call outliers over here. Ooh, that's great handwriting, Sarah. Even though there are some outliers over here, there is still a general trend going on here, right? And so we can say that these events are correlated except for some outstanding variables. So correlation coefficient is that operational definition that we are putting to relatedness. Correlation is not causation, people. It is not causation. You have heard me say this multiple times. You'll probably hear me say this a lot more throughout the course of this class, but we need to understand that correlation is not causation, right? Obviously, this slide got a little messy here. I added in my own typing to make sure you get the gist of it. But this idea of correlation not being causation can be proven in a lot of different ways. Here are a couple of examples, right? People who floss more regularly have less risk of heart disease, right? Does flossing make your heart stronger? Probably not, right? If the data is from a survey, we might conclude that flossing might prevent heart disease, or that people with heart healthy habits also floss regularly, right? People who take care of their teeth and are conscious of their hygiene, right, are probably more likely to like go for a walk or a run or like do things that are good for them, right? Whereas people who don't floss as often aren't as likely. So when we say correlation does not equal causation, right, while there is like an increase in flossing Also, people who have an increased flossing, well, you know what I'm saying, people who floss more are also the same people who are less likely to have heart disease. That does not mean that flossing leads to less heart disease. The second example, people with bigger feet tend to be taller, right? Does this mean that having bigger feet causes height, right? Is one a cause of the other? Or is it we are born with certain attributes, and because our bodies are taller, right, our feet need to be bigger to support us? Right? Another example, this is one of my favorites. I still remember this from when I took AP Psychology in high school. But there have been studies done that show that ice cream consumption increases and violent crimes also increase. So in areas of the country, when we see a spike in ice cream consumption, we also see a spike in violent crimes, right? Why does this happen? Could it be the fact that cones look similar to knives and therefore subconsciously promote people committing crimes? Could it be that people who eat more ice cream have more sugar in their systems and therefore are more likely to go crazy and commit a crime, right? Probably not. The common denominator here in this particular example is, when do we eat ice cream? When it's summertime, when it's hot out. And when it's hot out, people are more often likely to get aggressive and frustrated, right? So hot weather leads to an increase in violent crimes. Hot weather also leads to an increase in ice cream. We know that causation does not equal, or correlation does not equal causation. While we see a positive correlation between ice cream consumption and violent crimes, right? We know that eating ice cream doesn't make you more likely to commit a crime. Let's go through just a few more examples, right? Women who have a baby after the age of 40 are more likely to live to be 100 than those who do not. In major U.S. cities, the greater quantity of ice cream sold, the greater number of murders, that one we just went over, right? The greater number of the greater number of churches in a city, the higher the crime rate, right? Maybe that's just population density. There needs to be more churches to support the amount of people living in an urban area versus a rural area, right? And therefore, there are higher crime rates because there are just more people, right? The more a person weighs, the larger their vocabulary, and people who had routine physicals in the previous 3 years are twice as likely to report high blood pressure and cholesterol levels, right? This last one here is like counterintuitive, right? If you go to the doctor and you get routine checkups, right, you should be healthy, you should feel better, you should be doing good things, right? Like, you shouldn't report high blood pressure and cholesterol levels. But if we think about it, the reason they're probably going to the doctor is because they have these conditions, right? So again, I say again and again and again, correlation does not equal causation. We're going to look at one more example. We're going to talk about why it's so important to then implement certain research methods and experiments as we're talking about psychology. So this idea of self-esteem and depression, right? Low self-esteem could cause depression, right? Depression could cause low self-esteem. Depressing events or biological predisposition could cause low self-esteem and depression, right? There's no way of knowing that like one causes the other, right? Until you do some sort of experiment or scientific study, which is what we are going to look at in this next short TED video. We know that the scientific method doesn't always work in psychology, right? There are a lot of intangibles, and that's why we resort to this idea of descriptive research, right? Why we revert to case studies and naturalistic observations, why we look for these correlating events. And so we're going to watch this quick video. It's going to give you kind of a rundown of what that looks like, and then we are going to switch our attention to experimentation, the placebo effect, and ethics. So hang tight, watch this video. We'll touch base real quick following it.
Studies have shown that taking vitamins is good for your health and bad for your health. That newly discovered herb can improve your memory or destroy your liver. Headlines proclaim a promising new cancer treatment and never mention it again. On a daily basis, we are bombarded with attention-grabbing news backed up by scientific studies. But what are these studies? How are they performed? And how do we know whether they're reliable? When it comes to dietary or medical information, the first thing to remember is that while studies on animals or individual cells can point the way towards further research, the only way to know how something will affect humans is through a study involving human subjects. And when it comes to human studies, the scientific gold standard is the randomized clinical trial, or RCT. The key to RCTs is that the subjects are randomly assigned to their study groups. They are often blinded to make them more rigorous. This process attempts to ensure that the only difference between the groups is the one the researchers are attempting to study. For example, when testing a new headache medication, a large pool of people with headaches would be randomly divided into two groups, one receiving the medication and another receiving a placebo. With proper randomization, the only significant overall difference between the two groups will be whether or not they received the medication, rather than other differences that could affect results. Randomized clinical trials are incredible tools, and in fact, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration often requires at least 2 to be conducted before a new drug can be marketed. But the problem is that an RCT is not possible in many cases, either because it's not practical or would require too many volunteers. In such cases, scientists use an epidemiological study, which simply observes people going about their usual behavior, rather than randomly assigning active participants to control and variable groups. Let's say we wanted to study whether an herbal ingredient on the market causes nausea. Rather than deliberately giving people something that might make them nauseated, we would find those who already take the ingredient in their everyday lives. This group is called the cohort. We would also need a comparison group of people who do not have exposure to the ingredient, and we would then compare statistics. If the rate of nausea is higher in the herbal cohort, it suggests an association between the herbal supplement and nausea. Epidemiological studies are great tools to study the health effects of almost anything, without directly interfering in people's lives or assigning them to potentially dangerous exposures. So why can't we rely on these studies to establish causal relationships between substances and their effects on health? The problem is that even the best conducted epidemiological studies have inherent flaws, precisely because the test subjects are not randomly assigned to their groups. For example, if the cohort in our herbal study consisted of people who took the supplement for health reasons, they may have already had higher rates of nausea than the other people in the sample. Or the cohort group could have been composed of people who shop at health food stores and have different diets or better access to healthcare. These factors that can affect results in addition to the factor being studied are known as confounding variables. These two major pitfalls, combined with more general dangers, such as conflicts of interest or selective use of data, can make the findings of any particular epidemiological study suspect, and a good study must go out of its way to prove that its authors have taken steps to eliminate these types of errors. But even when this has been done, the very nature of epidemiological studies, which examine differences between pre-existing groups rather than deliberately inducing changes within the same individuals, means that a single study can only demonstrate a correlation between a substance and a health outcome, rather than a true cause and effect relationship. At the end of the day, epidemiological studies have served as excellent guides to public health, alerting us to critical health hazards such as smoking, asbestos, lead, and many more. But these were demonstrated through multiple, well-conducted epidemiological studies, all pointing in the same direction. So the next time you see a headline about a new miracle cure or the terrible danger posed by an everyday substance, try to learn more about the original study and the limitations inherent in any epidemiological study or clinical trial before jumping to conclusions.
So that video, I think, does a really good job of tying all this up into like a nice, neat little package. It also references some ideas about the ethics behind research in psychology. We are going to touch on that briefly at the end of this lecture, so stick with me. Obviously, this is kind of a big overview of research, specifically like descriptive research, as we've been talking about, case studies, naturalistic observations, and surveys. But now we are going to take this idea and like why there are issues with this potential type of research, and switch our attention to experiments. Again, as we talked about the scientific method yesterday, the experimenting process may be a little bit of a review to you, so we'll chug through it as quickly as we can and make sure that we're getting ourselves prepared for the formative that you're taking after this, as well as tomorrow's day, which we'll be looking at stats. So how do you find out about causation, right? That video said, like, we can only infer causation from this idea of correlation, right? We can't fully prove causation. So how do we do that? We do it through experimentation, which is manipulating one factor in a situation to determine its effect, right? An example, which we're going to kind of let carry us through the rest of our content here in Unit 1, is that removing sugar from the diet of children with ADHD makes a difference, right? So like, does removing sugar, is sugar a cause for ADHD symptoms, right? That's the question. We're gonna, like I said, look at this particular example throughout today and tomorrow's lesson, but just kind of keep that in mind, right? We can pull kids who have diagnosed ADHD, we can pull kids who do not have ADHD, we can give some sugar, we can refrain sugar from some, and we can observe, and we can do an experiment to see how, with our observational or our operational definitions, we can say, like, how often is this kid inattentive? How often is this kid hyperactive, right? Like, we can use this as an experiment platform. Obviously, these shapes don't transfer over very well into this recording platform, so I'm just kind of like retyping in the definitions here. So when we're talking about experiments, we already referenced random sampling, but we need to recognize how it fits into our understanding of performing a psychological experiment, right? Random sampling is how you get a pool of research participants that represents the population that you're trying to learn about, right? We talked about men. If we're looking at traits in all men, we have to get men of all different backgrounds, ethnicities, religions, classes, all of the men to get a representative population, and that's done through random sampling. On the flip side, once you get those participants, right, we've randomly sampled a group of men, we've pulled them in, and then we want to do an experiment, we need to randomly assign the participants to control our experimental groups in order to control all variables except the ones that I'm manipulating. So like, I'm not just going to pull all like the fit, like that video just said, like I'm not going to pull all the like fit and healthy people and like give them some sort of experimental drug and say like, how do you feel? Like they're going to have a different response potentially to it than somebody who is unhealthy or who has a pre-existing condition. So we have to make sure that within our random sample, we're then also randomly assigning who is in the experimental group versus the control group. We're going to watch one more video on the placebo effect that talks about this idea of random sample, random assignment, and what the placebo effect is. I'm not going to talk specifically about the placebo effect, but you will have to know it. So this is going to kind of be how you get that content, and it gives a lot of examples of what the placebo effect is and how it relates to our understanding of psychological experiments.
In 1996, 56 volunteers took part in a study to test a new painkiller called trivaricaine. On each subject, one index finger was covered in the new painkiller, while the other remained untouched. Then, both were squeezed in painful clamps. The subjects reported that the treated finger hurt less than the untreated one. This shouldn't be surprising, except trivaricaine wasn't actually a painkiller, just a fake concoction with no pain-easing properties at all. What made the students so sure this dummy drug had worked? The answer lies in the placebo effect, an unexplained phenomenon wherein drugs, treatments, and therapies that aren't supposed to have an effect and are often fake miraculously make people feel better. Doctors have used the term placebo since the 1700s, when they realized the power of fake drugs to improve people's symptoms. These were administered when proper drugs weren't available, or if someone imagined they were ill. In fact, the word placebo means "I shall please" in Latin, hinting at a history of placating troubled patients. Placebos had to mimic the real treatments in order to be convincing, so they took the form of sugar pills, water-filled injections, and even sham surgeries. Soon, doctors realized that duping people in this way had another use: in clinical trials. By the 1950s, researchers were using placebos as a standard tool to test new treatments. To evaluate a new drug, for instance, half the patients in a trial might receive the real pill. The other half would get a placebo that looked the same. Since patients wouldn't know whether they'd received the real thing or a dud, the results wouldn't be biased, researchers believed. Then, if the new drug showed a significant benefit compared to the placebo, it was proved effective. Nowadays, it's less common to use placebos this way because of ethical concerns. If it's possible to compare a new drug against an older version or another existing drug, that's preferable to simply giving someone no treatment at all, especially if they have a serious ailment. In these cases, placebos are often used as a control to fine-tune the trial so that the effects of the new versus the old or alternative drug can be precisely compared. But of course, we know that placebos exert their own influence too. Thanks to the placebo effect, patients have experienced relief from a range of ailments, including heart problems, asthma, and severe pain, even though all they'd received was a fake drug or sham surgery. We're still trying to understand how. Some believe that instead of being real, the placebo effect is merely confused with other factors, like patients trying to please doctors by falsely reporting improvements. On the other hand, researchers think that if a person believes a fake treatment is real, their expectations of recovery actually do trigger physiological factors that improve their symptoms. Placebos seem to be capable of causing measurable change in blood pressure, heart rate, and the release of pain-reducing chemicals like endorphins. That explains why subjects in pain studies often say placebos ease their discomfort. Placebos may even reduce levels of stress hormones like adrenaline, which can slow the harmful effects of an ailment. So shouldn't we celebrate the placebo's bizarre benefits? Not necessarily. If somebody believes a fake treatment has cured them, they may miss out on drugs or therapies that are proven to work. Plus, the positive effects may fade over time, and often do. Placebos also cloud clinical results, making scientists even more motivated to discover how they wield such power over us. Despite everything we know about the human body, there are still some strange and enduring mysteries, like the placebo effect. So what other undiscovered marvels might we contain? It's easy to investigate the world around us and forget that one of its most fascinating subjects lies right behind our eyes.
So real quickly, just to reiterate after that video, right, control groups are going to be given a placebo effect. Once you've randomly sampled your population, you've randomly assigned them to a control group versus an experimental group. The control group gets like a fake drug. The experimental group gets the real drug. Nobody knows who is getting what. They even go so far as to institute studies that are double blind, meaning neither the people administering the drugs nor those receiving them know if it's the placebo or the real drug. And this is important because it gives us insight right into what is actually causing a change in behavior or feeling or whatever that might be, right? Again, this is probably review to you. I'm not going to go into like massive detail into this because your formative looks at this specifically, and you're going to have to actually like apply these ideas of experimental and control group, independent variable, dependent variable, and confounding variables. So I'll go over them just quickly. We'll do just a brief example, and then we'll talk ethics and be done for the day. So experimental group versus control group, we just talked about that. Experimental group is exposed to the treatment. Control group doesn't really have anything change for them. And so with that in mind, we know the independent variable or dependent variables. Independent meaning the variable that we are the variable that we are able to manipulate independently of what the other variables are doing, right? So that independent variable, if we're talking about like the ADHD, consuming sugar causes ADHD, we know our experimental group is kids who are eating sugar. Our control group is kids who are not. And we, in order to alleviate like confirmation bias and like trying to prove our hypothesis is right, we should really be looking also at kids who don't have ADHD to kind of bring in that idea. But looking at the independent variable in this particular example, it is sugar, right? The dependent variable is then like what is changing because of the introduction or removal of sugar from a kid's diet, right? So independent variable that we're able to manipulate independently. Kids get sugar or they don't. A dependent variable is the variable we expect to experience a change. So ADHD symptoms, how hyperactive are they, how unfocused are they, and whatnot, right? With that in mind as well, we also know that confounding variables exist, and these are other variables that might have an effect on the dependent variable. Example, sugar increases hyperactivity in all children, not just those ones that have ADHD. So it's hard to say that sugar is the cause of ADHD symptoms, because if a kid who doesn't have ADHD is also more hyperactive with sugar, it's a very difficult causation to define. So here's your example. Go ahead and pause the lecture here real quick. We're going to revisit that depression self-esteem example. Doctors are trying interventions that improve self-esteem to see if they cause a reduction in depression, right? This idea that we're going to teach them a new way to cope. Like maybe we're teaching meditation, right? What is the experimental group, control group, IV, DV, and potential confounding variables? Pause it, go through it yourself. We'll go over them in just a second here. Okay, so looking at this particular example, the experimental group is those patients who get the intentional interventions. They learn the meditation. Our control group is the patients who continue their regular therapy. They don't get any added teachings about how to meditate, right? Our independent variable is the interventions that improve self-esteem. Say meditation has been proven to improve self-esteem. We're teaching them how to meditate. That's our independent variable. Our dependent variable then is what's going to change. What's potentially going to change if they can meditate, they can heighten their self-esteem, and therefore we will see a change in depressive symptoms, right? So these are some examples of those particular elements of an experiment that you are going to have to know, and just recognize that you are going to practice that more in the formative you're doing this afternoon. An experiment is a type of research in which the researcher carefully manipulates a limited number of factors and measures the impact. In psychology, you will be looking at the effect of an experimental change on a behavior or mental process. This is just the psychology definition of what is an experiment. So here, I'm going to kind of cruise through this. We're getting a little long in our lecture, but this is just one more example if you want to take a second and read through it, right? The idea that breastfeeding increases intelligence, is that in fact true? If you breastfeed longer, your kid will be smarter. Does correlation in this regard equal causation? Well, we don't know. We can't just like observe, because there are confounding variables in terms of genes, right? The people who breastfeed longer and more may just be people who are more intelligent and they read more research studies, so they do more breastfeeding, or maybe they have higher jobs in which they can take longer maternity leaves, right? Because they have more intellect, right? There are a lot of confounding variables. So what do you have to do in an actual study? Women were randomly selected to be in a group in which breastfeeding was promoted. They then randomly assigned them. Had people stop breastfeeding, had people continue breastfeeding, and saw the intelligence scores at age 6, right? There's your experiment. So overall here, just taking a look at all of the research methods, you have descriptive research, you have correlational, and you have experimental. Those are the three we talked about today. Again, tomorrow we're talking about stats, and this, I'll just leave you with this screen You have to institute an actual study. Right here, you would have to randomly sample a group of women who are pregnant so that you can randomly assign some to continue breastfeeding versus not continue breastfeeding. Then you test the children's intelligence quotient at the age of 6, and you see if, in fact, overall, big picture, based on this experiment, there is causation to this particular idea that breastfeeding longer leads to higher intelligence in kids, right? This is a way to rule out those confounding variables. So just to wrap everything up, I'm going to leave you with this kind of chart. Feel free to take a picture of it. Feel free to jot it down in your notes, whatever. But this is just kind of the big picture overview of the 3 different types of studies that we looked at. We looked at descriptive, right? Looking at case studies, naturalistic observation, and surveys. We looked at correlational research methods, and we looked at experiments. Like I said, you are going to be asked to differentiate between these ideas and actually implement some of the research methods in your formative that you're about to take. So I'll leave you with this to kind of look at the differences and similarities between these types of research strategies.
There you have it, research strategies. Again, I just wanted to pop back on here at the end to remind you again, you do have that formative check to do if you hop on Canvas. It's called the Types of Research Formative Check, or the Experiment or Correlation Assignment. Do note that we have optional office hours today at 2. So once you've kind of worked through this content, if you have any questions, hop on. I'm just going to have my video off. I'm going to be working, doing my thing. So just make sure you join. I'll get a notification and I'll hop on and we can chat. Hopefully you were interested by the case of Phineas Gage. We're going to reference back to that time and time again, especially as we get into biopsych and understanding different areas of the brain and what their function is. But I think he is a really good example of a case study and how we use case studies in psychology. So just keep that in mind as we're heading forward. Tomorrow you're going to talk about statistics in psychology, right? This is a math class, but we have to understand the very bare minimum to understand the research. So we're going to do that tomorrow. You'll have another formative check. And then on Friday is your FRQ. Again, I will be available Friday morning at 8:20 to 9 o'clock-ish, as I would be before school if we were in class, to answer any questions that you have before hopping into that FRQ. Again, if you have questions about what that's going to look like, office hours this afternoon would be a really good place to touch base with me. All right, have a great rest of your day.